Noah's Ark and the flood. I like to start off with fun. Are you guys ready to start off with some fun? We really missed the boat. That's probably the first undocumented use of this phrase. Here's another one. This is Noah and his wife. Dear, I have something that may not be easy to accept, but I got to tell you. God just told me that we need a very large boat. At first, Noah's wife thought her husband was just trying to tell her he wanted a boat. Wives, do you have husbands like this? Yeah, you know. Some over here too. All right. So the flood and the ark are in Genesis. I work at Answers in Genesis. Where do you think I'm going to start? It's actually going to be in the Psalms. I'm going to start with Psalm 119. This is 158 through 160. I see the treacherous and am disgusted because they do not keep your word. Consider how I love your precepts. Revive me, O Lord, according to your loving kindness. The entirety of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous judgments endures forever. Do you realize that the flood is a righteous judgment? Sometimes we look back and say, wow, I feel really sorry for these guys. Well, you know what? It was a righteous judgment. God always makes a righteous judgment. But some of the other fascinating parts about this particular passage is, I see the treacherous and am disgusted because they do not keep your word. You know, the Bible is the ultimate truth in our world. God is the ultimate truth. And what blows my mind are there are statistics that will shock you even within a church. Take a look at this one. This was from Barna Research all the way back in the year 2000 again. It says 27% of all the people who attend an evangelical church do not believe in absolute truth. Now, as a reminder, the Bible's the absolute truth, right? God is the absolute truth. More than 1 in 4 that sit in our churches do not believe it. Friends, the mission field has walked into the church. Here's another stat. This was done more recently. This was with Ready to Return. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around this particular statistic. 83% said that this is kids in church. 83% said that their science teachers taught them that the earth was millions or billions of years old. These are just the kids in church. So some of these are kids that are homeschooled. Some of these are kids that are in Christian schools that have been taught this. It is out there. It is tough to miss this concept of millions of years and the rock layers being evidence of millions of years instead of from a global flood. So we're going to talk about the flood. We're going to talk about Noah's Ark and some of the fascinating things about that. Just to give you a big picture, you have creation, you have the fall, then you have the flood, then you have the Tower of Babel, and then you have the call of Abraham. I'm going to give you a few highlights in the book of Genesis. Genesis 6, verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Wow, kind of reminds you of newspapers today, doesn't it? Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. Just imagine that, springs of the great deep bursting forth. At the Creation Museum, we have a video of this where you see this, the springs of the great deep bursting forth, and you see this massive storm that then goes in and encompasses the entire earth and to begin that 40 days and nights of initial rain. Genesis 7:18 through 20. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. A very violent group of people were met by a very violent flood. Genesis 8, verses 4 through 5. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. And then finally, in Genesis 8, 13 and 14. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried off from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. And that's when the Lord called them off the ark. Just to give you a big picture, the flood duration, you have the 40 days and nights of initial rain. That's essentially when the ark raises up. So all total, you have about 5 months of flooding, including a peak water level somewhere in there. And that's where the water was increasing. And then you have about 5 months of the water receding or going down. And then you have about 2 months of drying time. If you use the old 360-day calendar that a lot of ancients use, that would be about 360 days, 361 depending on rounding. I know if you use a different calendar, you get slightly different numbers on that as well, but it was definitely about a year-long flood. Now just imagine for a moment, just imagine being cooped up in an ark for about a year with just your family. Would you guys be ready to get off that ark or what? I've got 4 wonderful kids, and I'll tell you what, if you want to know the definition of sin, my kids know it. I'll tell you. Well, the first thing I want to address is, are there any flood legends around the world? We actually find massive numbers of flood legends all over the earth. I used to say somewhere between 300 and 500 flood legends, but that's far more than that. In the research that I've done. I did a book on flood legends that's out here. It's kind of like the Dragons, Legends, and Lore. It's the Floods, Legends, and Lore. And I looked at about 200 flood legends, and I got tired of reading them. I was just that tired of it, of dealing with it. But like I said, I used to say there was between 300 and 500. Now I say over 500. And there's a reason I say over 500. We're actually working with an expert who's been looking at flood legends for a number of years. He's writing a multi-volume set. He's trying to accumulate every flood legend in the world. He has done North America and he's done Central and South America. With North America, he found 170 flood legends. In Central and South America, he found 160 flood legends. So that right there is over 300 just between the Americas. He's working on Oceania and Australia, New Zealand, those particular areas now. At the same time, he's trying to do some research in Asia. But there is a massive number of flood legends. This is exactly what we expect. I want you to understand this. This is what we expect from a biblical viewpoint. Because we have Noah, it's a real event. The real thing occurred. As people go to different parts of the world after the events that occurred at the Tower of Babel, they're going to take their history with them. They're going to take their legends with them, and they're going to deviate, and they're going to get warped and skewed, and we tend to expect that. So this is actually an incredible confirmation of a global flood, of an actual flood that occurred in Genesis. Consider for a moment, if there was no global flood, should we expect global flood legends? No. Now, some of these flood legends will blow your mind. You know, for example, they have them up in the Andes Mountain, which is 2 miles high. They say water covered the entire earth, covered those mountains, and it's 2 miles high. We have flood legends in places that are a desert where they hardly get any rain at all, and they have flood legends. It's incredible to see some of this. Just some of the commonalities among a handful of them here. Man in transgression is quite common. Divine destruction. I don't know if you can read these. I know it gets to be fine print here. There was oftentimes a favored family. There was an ark or a boat somehow provided. Destruction by water. Well, I guess you're going to have a global flood legend. You're going to have destruction by water. Humans were saved. Many times animals were saved. Universal destruction. A lot of times they landed on a mountain, which is fascinating considering some of the flood legends that we saw out there. There were no mountains where they were at, which I'm blown away by that. In many cases, birds were sent out. In some cases, they retained that it was a dove that was sent out. Survivors worshiped God. There was divine favor on the family. We see so many commonalities among these. It's neat. Do you guys want to see a handful of them? I'll show you a handful of them here in this talk. And I want you to understand, I'm keeping you to the short ones. Sometimes they're like a whole chapter long, or sometimes entire books worth. But here's one of the Aztec legends of the flood. A man named Tapi lived a long time ago. Tapi was a very pious man. The Creator told Tapi to build a boat that he would live in. He was told that he should take his wife, a pair of every animal that was alive, into this boat. Naturally, everyone thought he was crazy. Then the rain started and the flood came. The men and animals tried to climb the mountains, but the mountains became flooded as well. Finally, the rain ended. Tapi decided that the water had dried up when he let loose a dove that did not return. Is that not incredible? Here's one from Hawaii. Okay, Hawaii. Let's face it, people didn't walk to Hawaii, did they? They had to take boats, so they're pretty familiar with water and that sort of thing. Hawaiians have a flood story that tells of a time when, long after the death of the first man, the world became a wicked, terrible place. Only one good man was left, and his name was Nu'u. You can almost see a reflection of the name Noah in there, can't you? He made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. In this story, the waters came up over all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nu'u and his family were saved. Oh, that's neat. Here's one in China. There's a number of them in China, actually, but here's one of them. Another flood story is from China. It records that Fuhi, I hope I'm saying that right, his wife, 3 sons and 3 daughters escaped a great flood and were the only people alive on the earth. After the great flood, they repopulated the world. Here's one from Africa. Once upon a time, the rivers began to flood. The God told 2 people to get into a ship. He told them to take lots of seed and take lots of animals. The water of the flood eventually covered the mountains. Finally, the flood stopped. Then one of the men, wanting to know if the water had dried up, let a dove loose. The dove returned. Later, he let loose a hawk, which did not return. Then the men left the boat and took the animals and the seeds with them. So you can see how this gets corrupted. Did they take seeds? It's possible. That Noah and his family probably thought about those things. But notice the dove and the hawk. In the Bible, Noah first let loose the dove and it returned. He also let loose a raven that did not return. So you see raven and hawk. A lot of times you see certain local animals replace other animals as well, or different local mountains and so forth. But I want to test your minds today too. I want you to realize that there are flood legends that are still beginning to occur. Did anyone see or know about the movie Noah? I want you to understand this is a flood legend. That's what it is. It's not an actual account of the flood in the Bible. It wasn't meant to be accurate. The director, Darren Aronofsky, he was very adamant that this is probably the least biblical film that's out there. What that means is it is a flood legend. So, bear in mind that does happen. Another type of modern local or legend of the flood is a local flood. Those are fairly new ideas, but these are flood legends nonetheless. Here was one from Don Stoner. He believes in millions of years and a local flood. Here's what he says. The flood was indeed a river flood. Now I want you to understand, this is a Christian man speaking. The language of Genesis allows for a regional flood. The parts of modern Iraq, which were occupied by the ancient Sumerians, are extremely flat. The floodplain surrounding the Tigris and Euphrates rivers covers over 50,000 square miles, which slope toward the Gulf at less than 1 foot per mile. Drainage is extremely poor, and flooding is quite common. Even without large rainstorms during the summer river level peak when Noah's flood happened. Where does the Bible say that happened during the summer river flood peak, number 1? Number 2, if this really was a little local river flood and it's flowing toward the Persian Gulf, why was the ark found in the mountains up above in the opposite direction? In the mountains of Ararat. You see, there's a lot of problems with it when you start looking at it. So over and over again, people are going to start promoting more and more of a local flood the more that people buy into millions of years. So we need to be aware of that. These are just legends of the flood. Genesis 7, verses 18 through 20. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. This previous quote just said, the language of Genesis is conducive for a local flood. How is this possibly a local flood? Does this make any sense whatsoever for being a local flood? No, it doesn't. Another thing that we see in those flood legends as people go to different parts of the world, we see a lot of names of Noah. You got a hint of that with Tapi and Fuhi and Nu'u and so forth. We actually find these names all over the place, and this is just a handful. I'm just giving you a taste of these right here. I wasn't going to put them all up here. You guys wouldn't be able to memorize them all that quick anyway. But, okay, I want you to understand something. After the events occurred at the Tower of Babel, a lot of people probably came out with a multitude of names. We sometimes don't think of that. So if you think of Noah, his wife, his sons, his grandsons, and so forth, they probably came out with a multitude of names depending on which language was looking at them. So I expect to see things like this. So I love this kind of stuff. But the Bible never tells us the name of Noah's wife. I know people have speculated and so forth, but we even find some of the names of Noah's wife. And of course, again, I'm giving you just a sampling here. There's actually an old book written about 100 years ago on the 101 names of Noah's wife. Now, it's interesting, some of these are very similar to each other. Imzar or Noah Imzar, which is probably Imzara, Noah's Imzar, that sort of thing. Naamah is one of them. I always thought Naamah was a fascinating one because Naamah is mentioned in the Bible. There's 2 women, there's actually just a handful of women, particularly before Sarah in the Bible. And, Lamech had married 2 different women. You have Eve, and then you have this other lady you have a lineage that leads right up to this woman named Naamah, right next to Noah's lineage. So there's actually one of the Jewish legends is that Naamah is actually Noah's wife. We don't know that for sure, but some people have postulated that. One of the other names in Jewish literature is Imzara. That's also the Persian name for it, so it makes you wonder, did they get that when they were under captivity in Babylonia and Persia before they officially came back to the Holy Land? It's possible. If you go to the Ark Encounter, we use the name Imzara. We use the name Imzara's Kitchen. That is the name of the huge, gigantic 1,500-seat restaurant that has a wonderful buffet, by the way. You guys hungry yet? Yeah, see, you have to throw that out there every once in a while to get people thinking about the food at the Ark Encounter. Actually, the number one question people ask in church is, where are we going to eat afterwards? Fun aside. But here's a question I get a lot of times too, especially when I talk about Noah's Ark and the flood. I get this question, boom, where was the Garden of Eden? Boy, we get this a lot, actually, at the Ministry of Answers in Genesis. In fact, I've seen a lot of people answer this question. They give a horrible answer to it. So, where was the Garden of Eden located? Do you think it was in Australia? We had to put that on there. Ken Ham's the founder of the ministry, right? America. Canada. Oh, maybe a few amens in there. In the area around the present Tigris and Euphrates River. We can't know. It's not important. Actually, a lot of people have thought that it was in the area surrounding the present Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, notice the word present Tigris and Euphrates River. We're putting that out there for a reason. If you look, Genesis 2, verse 14, and the name of the 3rd river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the 4th river is the Euphrates. Well, here's what's interesting. You start looking closely at some of these rivers. It was actually one river that broke into 4 headwaters. And actually, Assyria, no, not quite in relationship here. Fact is, you start looking at this closely, this does not seem to match the geography that we have today. Now, there's a good reason for that. Don't forget about a global flood. We need to start thinking biblically. There was a global flood between Genesis chapter 2 and later on rivers that we have today, the Tigris and Euphrates. So you have a massive global flood, you have all this flood sediment, and now you have a couple of rivers named Tigris and Euphrates. Now, names transfer. I'm from Versailles, Illinois, which is named for Versailles, Kentucky, which is named for Versailles, France. See, names change or travel. People take those names to the New World. There's the Thames River, for example. That's in England. You also have a Thames River in New England. You also have one in Canada. You see, names transfer. It makes more sense that they utilize these pre-flood names in places afterward. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers we have today are actually flowing on top of massive amounts of flood sediment. So keep that in mind. And they actually don't match the geography very well. So it makes a lot more sense that even though you see the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in here, yes, the Tower of Babel was right there in this particular location, but the Garden of Eden probably was not. It was probably massively destroyed in the flood. Pieces and parts could be all over the place. So we need to think in terms of a biblical flood when we're answering a lot of these questions. So think of massive amounts of flood sediment. Now answer this question. Where was the Garden of Eden located? We don't know. Now, be discerning, because sometimes you're going to see different commentators, you're going to see different Bible maps. Oh, possible location for the Garden of Eden. But we need to be discerning about those sorts of issues. In fact, rock layers are fascinating. We talked a little bit about these rock layers with regards to the last session. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Now, when we look at these, we like to think in terms of the Bible's history, thinking in terms of the flood. And we do that at the Creation Museum. One of the things we have at the Creation Museum, we have a walk through of Bible history. And basically what you're doing, you're walking through what we call the 7 C's of history. How many people here are familiar with what we call the 7 C's of history? Good. Some of you know. Some of you are like, I have no idea what you just said. Well, here's what they are. They're just milestones throughout the Bible. Creation is at the beginning of the Bible. Consummation is at the end of the Bible. And we like to use these C's of history when we look at different aspects of the world. Let me run through these 7 C's just to give you an overview, a big picture taste of what we're talking about. Creation. In the beginning, God created everything in 6 days, rested on the 7th. It was a perfect creation. And then we have the corruption, when the world went from a perfect state to an imperfect state. And then we have the catastrophe. That's the flood of Noah's day. Then we have the confusion at the Tower of Babel. That's basically Genesis 1 to 11 right there. We're going to be talking primarily about the catastrophe in this talk. But then there's no reason to just talk about Genesis if we're not going to put Christ on top of it. We're upfront about that here at the Ministry of Answers in Genesis. In fact, we've had press come to the museum and they'll interview us at the Ark or at the museum, and they'll say, oh, just admit it, you guys are on about the Bible. Yeah, we are. We're on about the Bible and the gospel in the Bible. Let me tell you more about that. And it's interesting, the press will step back and say, oh, that's actually kind of refreshing, because most people, they don't want to say that they're on about the Bible. So they actually appreciate that. So, we're right up front with that. And we're right up front with the gospel, Christ's cross, and the consummation here. There's no reason to go out and preach Genesis, teach Genesis 1 to 11, and get people to say, wow, I absolutely believe that, if it's not for Christ. That's the foundation for Christ. Why give him the foundation without giving the pinnacle right on top of it? So what we're going to do, we're going to use some of these seeds of history from time to time throughout this weekend. And I'm going to be talking about the catastrophe here, looking particularly at these rock layers. And I'm going to teach you a principle, a very key principle here. And this principle has come under severe attack in the last 150, almost 200 years. The Bible teaches that the past is the key to the present. I'm going to say that again. The Bible teaches that the past is the key to the present. For example, I look out here, you're all wearing clothes, right? Why? Because of an event that occurred in the past. That's why we wear clothes today. Why do we have a weekend off? Because of events that occurred in the past. You see, the past is the key to understanding the present. But this principle has come under severe attack in today's culture. If you just look at some of the other aspects, I mentioned week, I mentioned clothing. Why do laws exist? Because of events that occurred in the past. Because we have an ultimate lawgiver, by the way. Why do you pay taxes to a Canadian government? Why do you pay taxes to an American government? Because of events that occurred in the past that set up certain boundaries and law. You see, things in the past affect the way our present world is. Why is there death and suffering? Because of an event that occurred in the past, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. Why do we need a Savior? Because of events that occurred back in the past. Why are there rock layers that have fossils? Because of an event that occurred back in the past. Now, you got the principle, right? The Bible teaches that the past is the key to understanding the present. Now, something happened because people started looking at rock layers a little bit different, particularly geologic rock layers. And these are some of the rock layers just outside of where the Creation Museum is. We got some roads that have these cuts in the hill, and you can see these massive amounts of rock layers. And if you ever go to the Creation Museum, don't be afraid to stop by one of these things, go out there. These things are chock full of marine fossils. It's fascinating to see some of these. I say the word fascinating a lot. I hope you guys are catching that, because it is fascinating. But you look at the Grand Canyon. People started looking at the Grand Canyon from two entirely different viewpoints. Was it a lot of water and a little bit of time here, or was it a lot of time and a little bit of water? You see, people are looking at the same evidence from two different viewpoints when it comes to these canyons. But you see, I want you to understand that these two different viewpoints have two different premises behind them. They have two different viewpoints. They have two different worldviews behind them. Either you're starting with God or you're starting with man. And so what we started to see was people challenge that principle that the past is the key to the present. They started to say, let's not start with the past to understand the present, let's reverse it. And that's where the idea millions of years actually came from. They started to look at the present to look at the past. Here's a key verse in this, 2 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4. Knowing this, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is this promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. Now, we saw examples of this as early as the book of Jude, and we're still seeing this even today. When we look at rock layers, people are saying things are continuing the way they always have been. People are still saying that. That's where the idea that these rock layers were slowly and gradually accumulated comes from. They're assuming things have always been the same way if you look back in the past. They're assuming there were no major catastrophes. Slow accumulations have been doing this. James Hutton, he was an agriculturist and an early geologist. He wrote a book called The Theory of the Earth in 1795. And here's one of the things he said, and this kind of triggered a change in the mindset of people in academia back at that time. He said, the past history of our globe must be explained by what can be seen happening now. Now, that's significant. Because he's saying, let's flip this. Let's not start with the past to understand today. Let's start with today to understand the past. He totally flipped it. He totally reversed it. He said, no powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe, no action to be admitted except those which we know the principle. When he says no powers, no God, no flood, leave it out of it. This is some of what we call naturalism today, uniformitarianism today. In other words, man's opinions are that the present is the key to the past. We look at rates and conditions today. How fast is this little river flowing? How fast is this stream flowing? How fast is it eroding stuff away? How fast are these rock layers building up just on a given day? Let's just ignore the catastrophes. And in fact, we see this at museums now. Understanding the present is actually the key to understanding the past. And that gave rise to naturalism's uniformitarianism. Boy, I threw some big words out there. Think of something being uniform. You know, something like a rock layer being built. It's uniformly being built at a slow, gradual, same rate process. This is that belief system, uniformitarianism. That's what became dominant, particularly in the 1800s. Yes, it was started by people like Hutton, and other people jumped on top of it. What they're saying is, ignore the flood and get rid of the flood. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water of the earth. Throw that out. We're not going to do that anymore. Slow, gradual accumulations over millions of years. That's what started to happen. I gave you this slide in the last session. The changing age of the earth. Buffon, 78,000 years. Werner, 1 million years. But there was a number of people in here. And there's James Hutton in here. They just put long ages on it. And one of the reasons that they were doing this is because of that uniformitarian belief system. Long ages, slow and gradual. Charles Lyell built on this. He wrote 3 books called The Principles of Geology, where he declared these rock layers evidence of slow, gradual accumulations over millions of years. And I've read big portions of these books. I didn't read all of it at once. But these books really are promoting the idea of slow, gradual changes in geology specifically. And what he does is he comes right out and says there was no global flood. He's directly attacking the Word of God with this. Well, since that time, people have adjusted it. Lord Kelvin, he had a couple of calculations that he did on assuming that the Earth was originally molten and that it cooled off. Based on those calculations, he got anywhere from 20 to 100 million years for the age of the Earth. Arthur Holmes was the first one to use radiometric dating. In 1913, he declared the age of the Earth 1.6 billion years old. Then Claire Patterson, 1956, 4.5 billion years. Group of meteorites. It didn't even come from the Earth. He radiometrically dated those and said the age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years. You know why? He assumed that naturalism was true and that the Earth was formed out of a nebular hypothesis, and so the Earth and the other stuff in our local solar system was all formed at the same time. So let's go find a meteorite that hasn't been affected by all the weathering here on Earth. Let's radiometrically date it, and that's the age of the Earth. So he's assuming naturalism to try to prove naturalism. Did you catch that? That's actually an affirming the consequent fallacy, begging the question. He's assuming the very thing that he's arguing, but most people don't catch that sort of thing. See, these rock layers are significant. Now I'm going to tell you something about these rock layers. Creationists and evolutionists actually agree on these rock layers. These are real rock layers. There really is a Cambrian rock layer. There really is a Devonian rock layer, a Cretaceous rock layer. Where we disagree is the timing about how long it took to lay down these rock layers. So I'm going to run over here. See here? See the Cambrian rock here? They say it took 100 million years of slow, gradual accumulations to lay down that Cambrian rock. We're looking at the same Cambrian rock. You look at the Cretaceous rock up there, they say, wow, look at this. It took somewhere in the neighborhood of about 72 million years. I know they vary by a few million years here and there. 72 million years to lay down that Cretaceous rock. They say that ended about 65 million years ago. We're looking at the same rock layers, boom, flood sediment. 2 entirely different interpretations of the same evidence, a global flood. Now I want you to notice something else here. In the secular world, if you propose the idea of a global flood, you're going to be shot down. You try to write a technical paper, put it out there in Science Magazine or Nature, one of these guys, and you're talking about a global flood, thrown out. You cannot have a global flood in the secular world. And here's why. If you have a global flood, it destroys the idea of millions of years. So they hold to that so firmly that you cannot publish a global flood there. Now don't worry, there's plenty of peer-reviewed places you can publish. Answers in Genesis even has a technical site called Answers Research Journal. You can publish technical literature there, and guess what? You can talk about a global flood there. That's not a problem. It's not off limits like it is out in the secular world. But you cannot have a global flood out there. Boom, it destroys millions of years. Can you have a global flood on Mars? Sure, go for it. Can't find much for liquid water there, but Earth, not a chance. Same evidence, two different interpretations of this. Now with Hutton and with Lyell, the ideas of uniformitarianism, millions of years in those rock layers, dominated. By 1870s, most of the Christian colleges in the United States and in Europe, these places had already caved to millions of years. They'd already bought into a lot of this naturalism. They may have had God in there, but they had the millions of years in the 1870s. You see, those ideas began to permeate. They permeated all the way forward, all the way up through the Scopes trial in 1925. But then, John Whitcomb and Henry Morris published a book called The Genesis Flood. You can see the revised cover up here, 50-year anniversary. This book sent shockwaves around the world. What was significant about this? You got a theologian, you have a scientist that got together and said, wait a second, let's challenge this millions of years. Let's get back to the Bible. Let's get back to the flood. And this book came back, and man, it was powerful. It was so powerful. You know, it affected even Ken Ham. Ken Ham was in Australia. He was praying for answers. He went to a little local Christian bookshop down there. They had hardly any books, but they had a book, The Genesis Flood. And that's where he got it. I think they only had one copy of it that they even got. Ken Ham got it. And you can see how that legacy has turned into places like the Institute for Creation Research. It's turned into places like Answers in Genesis. And you know what? There's so many ministries that would go back and say, this event right here is what triggered so many creation ministries to say, let's get back to the authority of the Bible. We've seen churches and seminaries and Christian colleges that say, we're going to get back to the authority of the Word of God. Let's get back to it. And I'll tell you what, this was powerful. But the damage had already been done by the secularists. So many Christian colleges had already waned and faded. Oxford was a Christian college. Harvard was a Christian college. Yale, Southern Illinois University, you name it. Most of these colleges were Christian colleges. And they are no longer Christian colleges. The world has taken them over because of uniformitarianism, secularism, and naturalism that now dominate. But I'll tell you what, this book here was powerful to get us back. I've had people say, well, where's the evidence of a global flood? Well, friends, it's all over the place. There's about 700 million cubic kilometers of flood rock. That's basically what you want to put in there, in the Earth's crust. Now, it's probably a little bit less than this because we do have some of the recent rock layers. But this just gives you an idea how much is actually out there. If you want this as a miles number, it's about 168 million cubic miles of flood sediment. So when people say, well, we don't have any evidence of the flood, yeah, it's all over the world. Mountains are built out of it. When you see these fossil layers, the vast majority of these fossil layers came from the flood of Noah's day. I've had people say, well, what about a continent? You know, was there any continental shifting? Was there originally one continent? I get that question actually quite a bit. Was there originally one continent? Well, you know, if you actually go back to Genesis 1, verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. Now, this is Creation Week. A lot of miraculous things are going on right here. And, you know, a lot of people say, okay, well, the waters were gathered into one place, so it makes sense the land was in one place as well. Now, could we be absolutely certain on that? Not necessarily, but a lot of people think, yeah, okay, originally there was some sort of original single continent. And some people have that as a Rodinia. Some people have it as a Pangea. And I notice my slide's a little off here, Pangeas. I need to work on that one. But either way, you've got some sort of C-shaped continent. For those who hold to a Rodinia, they have a Rodinia that then breaks into a Pangea, and then a Pangea that breaks into what we have today, all during the flood. Some people don't even have it entirely a Pangea. They have it not quite all put back together. So I know there is variations in these different models. And this is what we have as a result of the flood of Noah's day, with a little bit of geological activity since the time of the flood. You know, another thing people say, but they say, Bodie, come back to that local flood, because that local flood's a big deal. And I've had people say, this idea of a local flood versus millions of years, you got to explain that a little bit more. Because So many of these Christian colleges now that have been wavering, they buy into a local flood. We have kids at churches and kids that go off to Christian college come back and say, oh, well, it can't be a global flood. How do we deal with that? Well, there's actually a number of ways. But I want you to understand, once again, that these different views, theistic evolution, gap theory, framework, progressive creation that puts millions of years into Genesis 1, they have to appeal to a local flood up here. They have to do that because it's the same rock layers. It's either evidence of a global flood or millions of years. You can't have both. Otherwise, a global flood's going to tear up those rock layers and lay down new ones. So you got a big problem with that. And I've had people say, if you just go back to the Bible, you'll see it's not a global flood. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. How would this possibly be a local flood? It makes no sense. No sense at all. See, when you actually go back and read it, everything under the whole heavens was covered with water. That is clearly a global flood. The language, talking about it in Hebrew, you have a lot of the absolutes, Mabul, with the flood and that sort of thing. So, I mean, you've got some incredible reasons for a global flood. I've had people say, but Bodie, we don't have enough water to cover Mount Everest. Where's all that water? Well, do you realize if you take Mount Everest and bring it down, you take the ocean basins and bring it up, bring your continents and ocean basins about to a level, we have enough water to cover the entire earth 1.6 miles deep. So we have plenty of water. What we need to remember is that the crust, the mountains are rising, the valleys are sinking down. We see those shifts and changes during the flood. Okay, think about a flood. There's a time when everything's covered with water. Then all of a sudden we have the mountains of Ararat. Well, that gives an idea that we have mountains rising, we have valleys sinking down. We expect that. In fact, the Bible talks about this in Psalm 104. Psalm 104 is a fascinating psalm. See, I said fascinating again. That's my word for the day. It's fascinating. What happens in Psalm 104 is you start off with creation. It transitions to the flood, and then it transitions post-flood. This is part of that portion talking about the flood. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they may not again cover the earth. When was it that God made the promise that the waters would never again return to cover the earth? At the end of the flood. So this gives us a taste of this. The mountains are rising, the valleys are sinking down. So when we think of Mount Everest was nowhere near as tall as what it is today. At one stage it was underwater. So the mountains were rising, the valleys were sinking down. We don't know exactly how much land surface area there was originally. We just don't know. Makes sense that there was a lot of shallow seas because about 95% of the fossil record is shallow marine organisms. At one stage, we had no land surface area. It was actually very nice of the Lord to give us about 30% back, wasn't it? It really was. Well, what about a diet problem? Do you guys have a diet problem? My wife says I have a diet problem sometimes. I'm on all these pills with my heart medication, and as a result, it makes you crave certain things and not crave other things. I recently got on one that it really makes me crave sweets. And that's a bad thing. I want you to understand that. But yeah, diet problem. This is a totally different diet problem. Genesis 1 verse 30, all the animals were originally vegetarian. Here's what it says. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, which has the breath of life, I've given every green plant for food, and it was so. Now remember, it's a God of life. Or he is a God of life. Maybe I should put it that way. He is a God of life. He created a world full of life. It was a world without death originally. So we didn't expect animals to be killing other animals and eating other animals. They gave green plants for food. Now, plants are not living in a biblical sense. In our modern biological sense, we sometimes define plants as living, but in the Bible, they were not considered life. They were not considered nephesh kaya, is that phrase in Hebrew. Fact is, protists and cells and things like that, they're not considered alive. Fungus, for example, is not considered alive. Humans were alive and made in the image of God. Animals were alive, but not made in the image of God, just to give you a little bit of a taste at that. Plants are like solar-powered, self-replicating biological machines. Say that 5 times quickly. But yeah, these were specifically made for the purpose of food and for other aspects, producing oxygen, sticking with cycle, and that sort of thing. So if we think about this, these things were originally all vegetarian. All these animals were vegetarian, man was vegetarian, and yet you look in the fossil record, what do you see? You see a lot of animals that ate other animals. This is just a small taste of it here. So you have a mammal that ate a little dinosaur. You have T-Rex that ate other little dinosaurs. Baryonyx ate an iguanodon. We see these things all the time. This shows that these rock layers had to form after Adam and Eve sinned against God and death and suffering came into the world. Genesis 2:16 and 17, this command was given to Adam. You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Now, I want to teach you something here. And this goes in depth. When it says surely die here, that is die in Hebrew. It means you will begin to die, more of an aggressive sense. We translate this as surely die. You're going to start to die, you're going to begin to die, you're finally going to be dead. That's what that really means. Now, if you go back to Eve, you know, this command was obviously related to Eve because when the serpent came to the woman and said, hey, are you allowed to eat from all these trees? Her response echoed this, but it also changed a few things. Her response was slightly changed. You may freely eat. She took freely out. From any tree, she took any out. She also changed a few other little things in there. But one of the things that she changed, she said we couldn't even touch the tree, otherwise we're going to die. And when she said die once, which means die immediately. It's not die, which means surely die or begin to die. It means die immediately. And it's interesting, when the serpent came back, it was a very clever deception. He basically says, you will not surely die? You will not die? We miss that sometimes in our English translations. But that's actually a powerful way of looking at this. It was a very clever deception. Essentially, the serpent was quoting the Lord back against her on the meaning of die. It was very clever. You will surely die. So it was a very clever deception. When Adam and Eve sinned against God, things changed. Death and suffering came into the world as a result of their actions. Hebrews 9:22, indeed, under the law, almost all things purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. Which brings me to the next verse where I'm talking about skins. Sometimes the mind of a speaker. Genesis 3, verse 21, and the Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skin and clothed them. You see, the punishment for sin was death. Solution had to involve death. But we're in a culture where we're teaching millions and billions of years of slow, gradual changes that has death and suffering in those rock layers going all the way back. And many Christians want to accept that millions of years, and they want to put that into Genesis chapter 1 before Adam and Eve sinned. So you got two entirely different views of death here. We have some Christians saying, well, maybe you had millions of years of death and suffering. That's called very good. Adam and Eve sinned. It really didn't change anything. Because the punishment for sin was death. Well, death was already around. It would have actually been considered a good thing. No. If we start with the Bible, a perfect God makes a perfect creation. It's because of man's sin that death and suffering came into the world. And you see, it's our fault. Take heart, Christ stepped into history to save us from sin and death. And we look forward to a time when there'll be no more death or suffering, crying or tears. There'll be a new heavens and a new earth. That is something to look forward to, by the way. But if you put millions of years into Genesis chapter 1, you've tarnished God's statement that everything is very good. Oh, Adam, this is such a perfect world. Yes, Eve is very good, just like God said. And it's sitting on top of all that millions of years of death, pain, suffering, and extinction. And that brings us to a thorny problem, which we kind of alluded to this in the last session as well. Thorns are a bad thing. I grew up on a farm. We had a lot of thorn trees. We had to fight thorn trees left and right. They're the big thorns, the big long ones. Yeah, you had smaller ones from locust trees, small locust trees. We had different forms. You have all sorts of thorns and thistles. We are fighting this all the time. So I don't like it because I probably have scars all over me from a lot of those thorn trees that we had to fight and cut out, trying to fix fence. You got to go right through. Oh, that happens to be where the worst of the thorns are. And I've had to deal with that sort of thing. But see, thorns are a problem if you accept millions of years of those rock layers. Genesis 3, verse 17 through 18. Because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat of the plants of the field. See, thorns and thistles did not exist until Adam and Eve sinned against God. They are a bad thing. And, you know, there's some fascinating things about thorns. You can find some locust trees that have thorns, some that do not. You can find some blackberry bushes that have thorns, some that do not. It's interesting the way some of that works. You got some coconut trees that have thorns, some that do not. It's incredible when you start looking at this. So is it some sort of genetic issue as a result of sin and the fall? It's possible. There's a number of ways to look at this. But one of the things that we find in the fossil record is thorns. We find fossilized thorns as low as the Devonian rock. In the secular world, they say this is about 400 million years old, and yet we find thorns in there. And there they are. According to the secular world, 390 to 415 million years old. Of course, this is from flood sediment, just so you know. But flood sediment, we expect to find thorns in there, right? It's after Adam and Eve sinned against God, so we expect to see death and suffering in those rock layers. We expect to see thorns in those rock layers. There's also a rainbow problem. You know, so many of our Christian colleges are teaching the millions and billions of years, and that breaks my heart to see that. Look at that beautiful rainbow. It's a promise from God that He'll never again flood the entire earth as He did Noah's day. Oh, my Christian college professor said that Noah's flood didn't cover the entire earth. What he told you was just a localized flood? That's what he said. So he believes that God promised to never again send a localized flood? Ah. See, that's a problem there, isn't it? You know, the rainbow's come under attack in today's culture, hasn't it? It really has. You know, the rainbow is a promise from God that He'll never again send in a global flood to destroy all life. That's what He said. You know, at the Ark Encounter, we like to light up the Ark of an evening, and we like to use rainbow colors. Of course, we do some variation when we do things on Christmas time at the Ark, but we take back the rainbow. We want people to understand the true meaning of the rainbow. We're in a culture where people are trying to take the rainbow and give it an opposite meaning. I remember being at a shopping place one time, and I was standing in line checking out, and a lady a couple ahead of me had a cross on, wearing a cross necklace. You didn't think much of it. And then there was a lady between us, and apparently she was in some sort of gang, and she was getting very agitated. Very agitated. She kept looking at that cross. She was getting mad. And she was wearing a cross too. So that lady went to check out, and she stopped her. Why are you wearing that? Well, because I believe in Jesus, you know, my Savior. And I'm sitting there like, yeah, who doesn't know what a cross means? You know, I guess there are people that don't know. She's like, how dare you wear our gang symbol? She had no idea that that was a cross that's been used by Christ for many years. And yet, there she was criticizing. This lady's like, well, you know, Christians have been wearing this as a sign of Jesus for about 2,000 years. You know, that's why I can find Him so readily. I don't think our gang knew about that. Okay. But see, I want you to notice what happened. They took a cross, a good symbol, and they have taken it. They're not the only ones that try to take Christian symbols. There's all sorts of signs that Satanists try to take. Many of those signs are actually Christian symbols that have had Christian meaning many years back into the past. So that's something interesting to look up if you read about Satanism. I know we've got world religions and cult stuff on Satanism. I've done talks on it and that sort of thing as well. But see, a lot of times they take Christian symbols and they want to destroy it. It's no different with the rainbow. The rainbow has a specific meaning. The world wants to take it and they want to destroy it. But we need to take it back and stand on what its actual meaning is. So if the flood was local, you run into all sorts of problems then too. We've already alluded to some of them. But why did Noah have to build an ark if it was a local flood? Seriously, if this is a local flood, 120 years from now, we got a countdown, there's going to be a global flood. Hey, Noah, why don't you go over that hill? You know how much easier that would have been? I mean, do you realize animals would have been saved without having to be on the ark because they lived on the other side of the hill? Well, why did God have to send those animals the ark? They could have went over the hill too. Well, why did the ark have to be so big? Why did you have to put birds on it? I mean, seriously? They could fly over. Okay, fine. You're going to have a year-long flood in this little river valley. Fine, go over here. It's not a big deal. Why were birds, you know, I mean, it doesn't make any sense when you start looking at this. You know, there's other problems with the millions of years, though, not just regarding local flood issues. Take a look at some of these. This is the difference between MOY, which is millions of years, and biblical creation. If you have long ages, one of the things you have is the sun before the earth. According to the Bible, you had the earth before the sun. There's others, dry land before the sea. You had sea before dry land. According to long ages, you had the atmosphere before the sea. According to the Bible, we had the sea before the atmosphere. We had sun before light on the earth. We had light on the earth before the sun. You know, I mean, people want to argue about these sorts of things. Stars before the earth, according to the Bible, earth before the stars. Earth at the same time as the planets, earth before the planets. Marine creatures before land plants. Hold it, we had land plants before marine creatures. Earthworms before starfish, starfish before earthworms. Land animals before trees, trees before land animals. I'm going to keep going. We have plenty more here. Death before man, death after man. Pathogens like TB before man. Hold it, those things came after man as a result of sin. Land reptiles before birds. Hold it, we had birds before land reptiles. Birds were made on day 5. Dinosaurs were made on day 6. Land mammals before whales. Hold it. According to the Bible, we have whales before land animals. Again, day 5 versus day 6. Simple plants before fruit trees. Fruit trees on the same day as other plants. Insects before mammals. Mammals before the creeping thing. We see this over and over again. Land mammals before bats. Dinosaurs before birds. Hold it. If you go over here, we have bats before land animals and birds before the dinosaurs. Insects before flowering plants. Hold it. We had the flowering plants before the insects. Think about that for just a moment. We had the sun before the plants. Plants before the sun. I've had people say, "What? How can you have plants before the sun? You need the sun. It's overnight. It's not a big deal. It happens all the time." You know, I could go on and on with these types of things, but the point is, if you take millions of years, some of these evolutionary ideas, and you put that into Genesis chapter 1, the order is so far out, it doesn't make any sense. Friends, we need to nail Genesis 1 to 11 back to the door of some of these seminaries, some of these churches, and sometimes to our own heart. So what about Noah's Ark? If we're going to talk about the flood, we've got to talk about the Ark, right? Yeah. Now, as a reminder, how many people have been to the Ark encounter? Quite a few. So you guys kind of have an idea what Noah's Ark looked like. The rest of you have already seen pictures. We've already shown it to you. But Noah's Ark was a massive vessel. It did not look anything like this. Drives me nuts seeing these types of things. You know, I see these all the time. Now, you're not going to believe this, but I actually chatted with a guy, a grown man, that had walked away from the faith. And I was chatting with him, and I asked him, I'm like, well, why'd you walk away? He's like, well, there's no way the Ark possibly could have done what it did. You know, saving the animals and that sort of thing. He's like, that thing would have sunk and all sorts of things. And I was like, well, no, I mean, it's 300 by 50 by 30. And he's like, what? You know, I started explaining the shape and all this stuff. And he's like, what? Finally, we got to it. He actually thought Noah's Ark, that Christians really believed it looked something like this. Honestly. He honestly believed this. And I'm like, where did you get that idea? And he's like, well, I grew up in church. It was a big picture on our nursery wall. He saw it in all the children's Bibles. He honestly thought that's what Christians believe. So when I started explaining what the real Ark looked like, he was like, well, I've never heard any of that. This is a kid who grew up in church, and he'd never heard any of that. So, I mean, yeah, this can be detrimental to a certain degree. I mean, the only thing accurate in this image is the look on those elephants' face. We're not going to survive this flood. You got to be kidding me. As soon as Noah gets cold and fires up the fireplace, those giraffes are toast. There it goes. I love the giraffe skeleton. Genesis 6, verses 15 and 16. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above. And set a door in the ark in its side. Make it with the lower, second, and third decks. So what's a cubit? Okay, let me see some cubits. Hold up your cubits, fingertip to elbow. That's your cubit. Now the Bible actually listed 2 cubits. You had a shorter or common cubit, and then you had a cubit and a handbreadth, which was your longer, your royal, or your older cubit. More than likely, Noah used the older cubit because it doesn't get much older than him with regards to these cubits. Your shorter cubits were anywhere from about 18 inches. It sometimes ranged 17 to about 18 inches. Your longer cubits about 20 to 21 inches. What's interesting is my cubit is like exactly 18 inches, and it's like exactly 20.4. So if you want to see, there they are. But if you translate that to the ark, using the older cubit here, Noah's Ark would have been about 510 feet long, its width 85 foot, and 51 feet high. Just to give you an idea of what this actually translates to, it's longer than a football field. Now I need to know my audience. If you take 2 hockey rinks and put it together, it's still longer than that. That's right. And I've not been to Tim Hortons yet, just in case you're wondering. But yeah, Noah's Ark was gigantic. Just to give you a taste of it compared to some of the other famous ancient ships here, the Titanic was definitely longer than it. It was a steel ship. The Wyoming is actually very similar to the Ark if you use the shorter cubit. And the Wyoming lasted for 14 years before it sank. Small Santa Maria here is much bigger than it. But cruise ships today just dwarf the ark. The cruise ships nowadays are gigantic. But, it's interesting. The Lord says to Noah, I want you to build an ark out of wood. We sometimes think, oh, wow, he's going to make this ark out of wood. How fascinating, how advanced. I wonder if it was the other way around. I wonder if Noah was like, out of wood? Who makes ships out of wood anymore? Makes you wonder. So we sometimes have certain perceptions because we've been influenced by the world as well. We've had this mentality that people were very primitive or they didn't have good technology. They might have had fascinating technology. If we just think of the United States and Canada, I mean, you go back 500 years ago, there was no civilization for much here, particularly from the Europeans moving over on this continent. For us, there was not much. Given in about 400 or 500 years, look what we've built. We've had some pretty fascinating things. This was a 1,600-year civilization at the time of Noah. They might have had some technologies that blew us out of the water that we may not think about. So we've got to not let the world influence us thinking in terms of man being primitive, which is more of a secular view. Well, what about this question? Did all the animals fit on Noah's ark? We get this question a lot. A lot of times it goes something like this. The story of Noah's flood isn't real. Noah could never have fit those animals into the ark. Well, how big was the ark and how many animals need to be in it? Well, I don't know, but Noah could never have fit all those animals into the ark. If you believe an unknown number of animals cannot fit into an unknown size ark, check your math. Got a problem. But researchers have looked into this. They've looked, well, how big was the ark and how many animals need to be in it? One researcher, John Woodmarappy, a number of years ago, he really kind of spearheaded some of this research. He wrote a technical book called Noah's Ark, a Feasibility Study, and you can find this on the internet. But one of the things that he said is, let's try to maximize this. Let's use the smaller ark, and so he's using the smaller cubit, and he said, and let's try to put the maximum number of animals on board the ark. Now, you're taking kinds, which is roughly equivalent to a family level. Now, not in every instance. We do have exceptions to that. But he said, let's not use a family. Let's go down to a genus level. So you have even more animals, like massive numbers of more animals than probably at the kind level. So here's what he found out using the small ark and the maximum number of animals. He found that 46.8%, about 47% of the ark was used to hold all those animals. And the number of animals he came up with was 16,000 animals. Now, he also said, well, let's put a little bit more to this. He said you have to take food on there for all these maximum number of animals. So he calculated the animals, the foodstuffs needed different types, and using some of these numbers here, he probably didn't take loose hay, for example. So you got a range anywhere from 6 to 16%. Well, he said, you probably could have harvested water, but let's go ahead and put fresh water on the ark as well. He found about 9.4% of the ark's volume would have been used to hold all that. So if you tally all that together, about 74% of the small ark, with the maximum number of animals, maximum number of food, maximum amount of water, is only 74% of that ark. So there was plenty of space. Now, more realistic numbers, a man named Arthur Jones, back in the 70s, he actually wrote an article evaluating the kinds that would be on there. And the number that he came up with, his prediction, was about 1,000 kinds or about 2,000 individuals of land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. Now, when we went to build the Ark Encounter, we actually worked with experts for a number of years and said, hey, let's try to get some more realistic maximums on here. Of course, we're using the full-size Noah's Ark, and we're going to try to figure out what the kinds are, and then we're going to try to maximize that number a little bit. And here's what they came up with. About 1,400 kinds, which is a little bit higher than Jones. And that makes sense. We've discovered more animals since the 70s and that sort of thing as well. But you get a range, a minimum of about 3,000 animals, maximum about 7,000 animals. So at the Ark Encounter, we're using the number, it's just less than 7,000 animals that we use at the Ark Encounter. So these things would easily fit. Just to give you a taste, these animals would have fit on just one deck of the Noah's Ark that we built there at the Ark Encounter. So yeah, there was plenty of space for food, for potentially food, fresh water, and all sorts of other things. What about dinosaurs in Noah's Ark? Before we built the Ark Encounter, I used to get people that would ask this question. They'd say, how did you fit them great big dinosaurs on that little bathtub ark? And of course, the ark was huge, right? I mean, it's something like this. Here's how you answer that question. How could Noah fit all the dinosaurs into the ark? How was it possible for your mother to give birth to you? Even the largest full-grown creatures were once much smaller. So yeah, a large ark, take the smaller animals on board the ark, yeah, that's not a problem. In fact, yeah, the dinosaurs would have been on board Noah's Ark. That sometimes surprises certain people. But yeah, you had to take 2 of each kind, 2 of each sort on board the Ark, which would have been 2 of each of the land-dwelling, air-breathing dinosaurs, of course, would be part of that. Now, for a lot of years, you might see that creationists referenced that there was about 50 different dinosaur kinds. Now, when we did the Ark Encounter research, we had to look at this in a little bit more detail. So we worked with a lot of researchers on this too, and this number actually fits within that range. But a good rule of thumb for a kind, if they can interbreed together, they're part of the same kind. The problem is we don't have dinosaurs around anymore, so we can't see what's interbreeding with each other, so it's tougher. So we have to do what we call a cognitum level. We're basically looking at their bone structure and other things to try to figure this out. And here's what we found. We found that there is a range, a minimum of 36 dinosaur kinds and a maximum of 85 kinds. So you're talking about 160 to 170 individuals on board Noah's Ark, and that's the number we use at the Ark Encounter, the maximum of about 85. So yeah, we do see some variation. You know, when you look at some of these dinosaurs, you can kind of tell these are probably very similar enough to be part of the same kind, the ceratopsian kind, Torosaurus, Pentasaurus, Triceratops, and so forth. And think of that with regards to dogs. We see a lot of variation in dogs. Same sort of thing with the ceratopsians, same sort of thing with the sauropods. And keep in mind, too, they probably took the smaller, the juvenile dinosaurs on board the Ark as well. Well, one of the questions that I get sometimes about the flood and dinosaurs, if humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, why aren't they found buried together? All right, let's just think for a second. Let's say there's a global flood happening right now. Are you going to be like, oh, there's a lion, I want to get buried with you? Probably not on your mind. Okay? Same sort of thing, they probably weren't living together. There's a number of factors here. The rarity of fossilization. The fact is we don't find a whole lot of dinosaurs. We've only found maybe 60 or so T-Rex fossils. Sometimes it's just a single bone. So finding it buried with something is actually quite rare. What was the population of humanity? With animals, the world was originally created full of a lot of animals. Okay? If you think of mankind, we started with 2 people, and we're told to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. So what was the population after about 1,600 years? There's only 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Think about that. That's not a whole lot of generations. Yeah, you can still end up with a lot of people that way, but consider some of the other things. If the world really was violent and vicious and wicked, if everyone was a murderer, the entire population drops in half in one day. See, we sometimes don't think about that. Plus, in very evil cultures, the first people that get annihilated and get attacked and destroyed are the youth, are the children, are the babies. We see that today. We see rampant child sacrifice today all across the Western world, China, places like that. Now, if there's 168 million cubic miles of flood sediment, and let's assume that there was 200 million people, and I think that's very generous, by the way. I think it's far less than that. Let's say every single one of them were fossilized and evenly distributed. That would be about 1 fossil per cubic mile. That's like a needle in a haystack. The fact is, it'd be easier to find a needle in a haystack than it would be for that. But the obvious answer is humans and dinosaurs were probably not living in the same area, buried in the same flood sediment. 95% of the fossil record actually consists of marine organisms. Of the remaining 5%, 95% of that is algae, plants, trees, and invertebrates. Of the remaining 0.25% is vertebrates that are things like fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Just to give you a taste here, those 0.0025%, that's the fine print up here, are vertebrate fossils that have more than a single bone. So yeah, there is a rarity of fossilization as well. But consider, sometimes things can travel a long ways, things can be heavily destroyed. The tsunami of 2004, I was in Australia when this hit. It didn't hit the coast that I was at. Sad event that hit Southeast Asia. There were about 60,000 people that went missing right there in that little local flood right along the coast that we never found. So it gives you an idea. A lot of things probably rot, decay, are destroyed, and otherwise not fossilized or buried rapidly. Sometimes things can travel a long ways. The tsunami that hit Japan, a lot of debris was washed out to the ocean. Some of it actually washed up on the western coast here of Canada and the United States. This was a Harley Davidson. That's a motorcycle. I can't remember if it was a Harley. I think it was. That had washed up from Canada. It was actually registered to a person over in Japan. So I understand the man survived, but his family had died in the tsunami, which is sad. We also see a number of living fossils. where people think something has gone extinct that didn't. This is probably one of the more famous ones. This is a coelacanth fish. It's probably one of the ugliest fish in the whole world. They thought this thing crawled out and evolved into all sorts of stuff on land. It's buried in rock layers long before dinosaurs, according to the secular world, so they thought this had something to do with that. And lo and behold, they found them swimming off Madagascar in India, and they were in the fish markets, and I guess that's not a missing link or a living fossil. Well, what about the structure of Noah's Ark? The structure of Noah's Ark is a fascinating study. It can be boring, I'll tell you that, because, if engineers, they might like this kind of thing, so if you're an engineer, you might like it. But there was actually an engineering study done to it, done by a number of Korean engineers, believers and unbelievers in that study, by the way. And come to find out, the ratio of dimensions, 300 by 50 by 30, is brilliant, incredibly brilliant. Noah's Ark actually sits right in between strength, comfort, and stability with regards to those dimensions, which are fascinating. Just to give you a taste, if you wanted a really strong Noah's Ark, it'd be really big. But the problem is it can capsize. It can fall over real easy. You don't want that in a Noah's flood. If you wanted a really comfortable Noah's Ark, it'd be like a cruise ship, really long, but you risk a hull fracture breaking in between it in the middle there somewhere. If you wanted a really stable Noah's Ark, yeah, it'd be really stable, but you can have all sorts of seasickness and stuff like that, kind of like a pontoon boat, think something like that. So injury is a big possibility. Noah's Ark happens to be sitting right in between there. It's incredible when you look at the engineering studies on that. What about the shape of Noah's Ark? Noah's Ark, you may have seen many images of it being kind of a box shape. You may be familiar with that. I've got a box-shaped ark in my office. I got the Lovett design as well. So, you've got a couple of different designs up here. The Ark Encounter is based on this bottom one, which is the Lovett design, the 300 by 50 by 30 using the longer cubit. But Tim Lovett is a mechanical engineer, and he's a bit of a ship expert. Lives in Australia. Has got 2,600 kids. I don't know how many kids he has, but it's a lot. I just had to throw that out there. Tim's a good friend of mine. But he actually did a lot of studies on ancient ships, stuff that were pulled out of the Mediterranean, ancient ship design. And one of the things he kept seeing over and over again were things like these stern projection, bow fins, and things like this. And one of the things that he postulated is maybe this was technology that was passed on from Noah and his sons down to some of the early generations, because we lost a lot of ship technology by the age of exploration. So, he did a lot of studies on this. One of the things that you want Noah's Ark to, the wind and the waves are coming, you want it to ride into the wind and the waves, right? It doesn't have a sail, it doesn't have an engine on it, and a propeller, so it's a floater. So it's got to be able to deal with the wind and the waves on its own. So that's why he's got certain features on here as well. He did some experiments where you put a box-shaped ark out into the water, you get the wind and the waves coming, you want it to ride into it, and what would happen is it would turn and shift and sometimes flip over. You don't want that for Noah's Ark. So after he put some of these features on there, he did some experimentation, and the wind and the waves would come in, and it would actually right itself as it kept getting pushed along. So it was really fascinating. See, there's that word fascinating again, his research. But that's the Lovett design. Are we absolutely certain this is a design? We don't know for sure, but it does give us a taste that there's a lot more behind it than just a remedial looking at this. Some people have asked, what about the window of the ark? The fact is, if you want to find out more, we have a website called worldwideflood.com. It was down here recently. I don't know why. We're trying to get it back up. But Worldwide Flood was run by Tim Lovett on a lot of the shape and the size and a lot of that research behind it. But I've had people ask, well, what about the window? Well, this is the window here on the top. That word window is the word sohar. And sohar literally means midday or something new, something that ran along the top middle that allowed in lighting and ventilation. And that's what it is. We do something like that nowadays when we build houses. We put a ridge vent on the top, does the same sort of thing. Well, I get this question every time I talk about Noah's Ark. Has Noah's Ark been found? If Noah's Ark had been found, you wouldn't be asking the question. That would be the biggest find ever. Now, of course, it came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, and that's a region from eastern Turkey to western Iran. And a lot of people thought it landed on Mount Ararat, but the Bible doesn't actually say that. Now, there's Mount Ararat and there's Lesser Ararat. And I want you to understand the mountains around this is the mountains of Ararat as well. And you can see the volcanic flow from Mount Ararat and Mount Lesser Ararat. Mount Ararat is a volcano. Its last eruption was in the 1830s or 1840s, if I recall. And you can see some of its debris flow. So if Noah's Ark was in here somewhere, it's probably been burnt up or covered up from that. But Mount Ararat is a gigantic mountain. It's about 17,000 feet high. So you need oxygen to get up to some of those areas. But you can see that debris flow here all around it. Some people suggested a Durapinar, but geologists have checked this out, and this is just a geological formation. Kind of looks like this all along that little area there. So most people have rejected that. One person had suggested an Iranian site, which a lot of people have backed off of. In fact, I think more so with that one, the press ran with it. Even though that person was suggesting maybe something but wasn't sure, the press ran with it, and they were like, no, no, no. One of the more popular sites is the Mount Cudi. It's actually pronounced Mount Judy, but it looks like Mount Cudi. It was also called ancient Mount Ararat. It went by a number of old names. A lot of ancient literature points to that particular mountain. Just to give you an idea, we see that from Jewish, Christian, and ancient Muslim sources as well. The Muslims claim they took the last of the big beams off of it about 1,000 years ago. Mount Judy here, its height, I don't know if you guys have ever been to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, or the Appalachian Smoky Mountains. The highest mountain in that particular range is in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and it's about the same height as this, about 6,000 feet. So it makes sense. A lot of animals could exit off of that. I have published on this. My friend Dr. Snelling, Andrew Snelling, actually reviewed that chapter for me because I know he's been heavily involved in this research as well. Is this the actual site? We don't know. One thing I want you to realize, you don't have to find Noah's Ark for the Bible to be true. It's a wooden structure. For us to expect a wooden structure after so many thousand years, I don't really expect to find much of it. We had a barn that didn't last 120 years. So keep that in mind too. Hey, how did animals get to places all over the world like Australia? We look at the world. They could easily travel to Africa, to Asia, to Europe. But what about Australia or the Americas? Actually, most creationists believe that there was an ice age that was triggered by the flood of Noah's day. I know there's variations in the models, but creationists and evolutionists actually agree on an ice age. They just have a whole bunch going way back in the past, where we have one major one triggered by the flood, warm oceans, cool summers. And what that does is it takes a lot of water out of the ocean and puts it on land. And what that does to your ocean level is it makes it drop. And we agree, actually, with the secularists that at peak, it probably would have dropped about 350 feet. And that exposes land bridges. You could potentially have walked all the way here to the Americas, all the way down to places like England, and all the way down to Japan, potentially as far as Australia. It's a little deeper in certain places than Australia, but there is tectonic activity down there. Now, one thing I want to do before I sum this all up, let's not miss Christ. I can talk about the flood, I can talk about Noah's Ark for hours on end, but let's not miss Christ in all this. You go back to the flood account, the word there, the Lord shut them in and that sort of thing. That word Lord is a variant of I am. That's Yahweh or Jehovah. That name was revealed to Moses in Exodus 3:14. In John 8:58, Jesus uses this before Abraham was, I am. You see, Jesus is intimately involved here. We sometimes disconnect that, but he is right there intimately involved. Notice the patience and judgment. This is an attribute of Christ right there, being so patient, 120-year countdown to the flood. Salvation was graciously offered through the ark and through preaching. I've always wondered, were there some people who responded to Noah and his preaching of righteousness that became righteous, but then they were killed before the flood? That's always a possibility. We leave that option open. You can't help but miss you had to enter through a door to be saved. Jesus is the door by which we are saved for all eternity. So the ark's door is like a type of Christ. But you can also rest assured in the promises of God. Christ right there, intimately upholding all things. Rainbow, seed time, harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall not cease so long as the earth endures. So let's not miss Christ in all this. Again, I want to encourage you to visit us on our website. A flood of evidence. We have a massive amount of information on both the flood and the ark and on the subject of millions of years. How do we know the Bible's true? Volume 1 and 2, I want to remind you of that. The fall of Satan, the Tower of Babel, begin, dragons. Hey, dinosaurs for kids. We have a number of kids' books out here. There's a number of them on dinosaurs. Kids love dinosaurs. We might as well be teaching them that because you know what? The secular world uses dinosaurs as an icon for evolution. So let's get that. This is probably for the bigger kids. For the littler kids, D is for dinosaur. And I know we have different format on this, but we have D is for dinosaur, N is for Noah, A is for Adam, little rhyme books. It has information on how you train this to your kids as well. And, one of the books here is on dinosaurs and the flood for the Kids Answers books. And, of course, you can buy the entire set together. I was involved in that. We have the Great Dinosaur Mystery Solved, one of my favorite books on dinosaurs. It's an easy-to-read book. It just gives you a biblical understanding of this, dragons, legends, and lore. We do have the Big Book of Earth and Sky and the Big Book of History, if you're not familiar with these. Again, World Religions and Cults. I mentioned about Satanism in there. Answers books have a lot of questions in here on the flood, on the local flood, on Noah's Ark, and millions of years. But here's the book. If you guys want a really good book, an easy-to-read book, this is by a theologian and an astrophysicist, and yet it's easy to read. Old Earth Creationism on Trial. It looks at framework hypothesis. It looks at theistic evolution, progressive creation. What's wrong with it from a theological perspective and a scientific perspective? This is a powerful book, by the way. Again, we have Already Gone, Already Compromised. I wanted to remind you of some of these books. The Big Book of History runs through the historical timeline here. I don't know exactly what all the DVDs are out here. I haven't had a chance to look through all of them in good detail. But one that I want to encourage you to consider, if they have it out here, this is great. If not, you can always get it on the website. Noah's Ark, Thinking Outside the Box. It's with Tim Lovett, looking at some of those design features and aspects of Noah's Ark. And we have Earth's Catastrophic Past by Dr. Andrew Snelling, looking at some of the geology. Now, this is more of a technical book. It's a little higher level. It looks at the flood. This is actually was done with the blessing of Henry Morris and John Whitcomb to be an update of the Genesis flood, because that, it was a great book 50 years ago. It was powerful, but we've learned a lot about geology since those times, so we really wanted to tackle some of that. What I'm going to do is close this out in prayer, and we'll be dismissed once again, and there might be some final announcements here from Cal, so I'll leave that to him. Dear Heavenly Father, I know we go through a lot of this information, and it's probably like breathing from a fire hose or drinking from a fire hose there, Lord. But hopefully people are able to retain a lot of this information about the flood and about the ark and be able to answer a lot of those questions that they get surrounding the flood and the ark. Lord, I just ask that you, once again, bless everyone that's here. Help them get answers, because you know what? Our culture is drilling us with millions of years, drilling us with dinosaurs and a lot of false information. Lord, help us be able to be discerning on those issues and help us get back to your word and stand firm in today's culture. Lord, we ask you send the Holy Spirit out ahead of us and guide us and bless us in all that we do. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys.